All right, hello. We're starting now the first video lecture on the first topic of the semester. And the first topic of the semester is titled The Idea of Progress in the Formation of Modern America. So this is going to be the first session. Now, before we begin, it is important to announce to the class that we're initiating the first part of the semester. If you remember, in the class introduction, I indicated that the semester will be divided into three main historical periods, and each historical period is going to contain three themes or three topics. So today, we're actually initiating, let me just show you the table of contents, so to speak, in that we're actually beginning part one, the first historical period, which is titled Building Modern America. Okay, so this is going to be a historical period that we're going to cover in three different topics that deal directly with building modern America. And those three topics that we're going to cover in this first part will be, first, the one that we're starting today, the idea of progress in the formation of modern America. This is going to be the first topic. We're opening up the semester with this topic, and today I'm providing the first session, the first class meeting, so to speak, which it is video recorded and will be uploaded again on Blackboard, of course. And each of those topics are gonna contain about three meetings or three video lectures. So every topic that we cover, give and take, they're going to be given in three sessions or three separate video lectures. Give and take. I mean, this is more or less what I take to cover each one of those topics. And every time I post the videos on Blackboard, you receive an email notification that those videos are already uploaded for you to view and take notes in your own schedule, by the way. But it's important that you watch them on a timely schedule, in a timely fashion. So please be advised that for this week, this particular week, this is the video that will be available on Blackboard. And so far, I have presented two separate videos. One video is on the class introduction that counts as a day of class, so to speak. That video is already on Blackboard. I already emailed you the notification for that. And for this week, this is the other video, which starts the lectures. So again, just be advised that for this first week, there are already two videos on Blackboard, one on the course introduction, and the other one, that this is the video that we're doing today, is on the first session on the first topic of the semester. Now the following week, you will receive another two videos. The days that I will be uploading the videos are not set yet. They might be Monday and Wednesday, or Tuesdays and Thursdays, but for sure there will be two videos per week posted on Blackboard once again. So let me introduce fully then this first part that we're initiating, Building Modern America, and pretty much put it into context as to, okay, so what are we going to cover here? I mentioned we're going to cover three topics on building modern America, but this is a period of time that spanned in the latter part of the 19th century. Roughly speaking, after the end of the U.S. Civil War in 1865, what takes place in the United States after the U.S. Civil War is a process by which the United States as a whole is going to modernize, enter the era of modernity. Okay, the entire nation becomes modern. Again, it takes many decades, of course, for this modernization process to take place, but this is a very important time in U.S. history because the country as a whole is going to undergo significant change and transformations, and that the way that people live in the past is going to dramatically be altered forever. For example, in the past, most people live in the countryside. The vast majority of Americans before the Civil War, the vast majority live in the countryside in small towns and farming communities and so on, and only 20 to 30% live in cities. But this process is going to reverse, in that by the end of the 19th century, most people in the United States are going to move to the cities and live in the cities, and just a small number of people, 30% or so, will remain still in the countryside, engaging in things like farming, etc. So life is going to radically change during this time. Again, this is the process that we call modernization or modernity, and it is the rapid transformations of human societies that are taking place in the 19th century in certain places of the world, like the United States. The United States was not, of course, alone in experiencing those changes. There were other countries as well that were experiencing those changes, particularly in Europe, places like England, France, Holland, Germany as well were undergoing significant transformations in the way that people lived, in the way that people organized their economies, for example, the way that people use tools. I'm going to talk about that, of course. Very high-tech tools are going to be introduced during this time. And again, in the 19th century, there were a group of countries that were moving in a new direction. They were living the ways of life of the past, of farming, for example, and agriculture, and they were now becoming fully industrialized. And in that process, again, they were modernizing. They were becoming modern. In that, once again, we see the coming of a commercial economy, a capitalist system, again, based on a market economy or commercial economy, in which most people were really producing products for the market. There was, again, millions and millions of producers creating businesses and shops that were able to provide goods and services to the population. And so we see the massive creation of businesses, particularly the large enterprises like industries, for example. The rise of big industries as well are taking place during this period of time. I mentioned the coming of the industrial city. More and more people are moving to the industrial cities, and they're moving there again to settle and live and work in the industries that are spreading across the cities, of course. And with that, we're going to see the growth, the exponential growth of a middle class. The middle class, of course, existed already in the United States prior to the Civil War, but after the Civil War, in this process of transformation and change, we're going to see the middle class growing exponentially. More and more people are going to rise up to the level of middle class. By the way, this is becoming a very large group. Also, throughout this process, we're going to see the introduction of new technologies that are characteristics of modern societies, such as modern transportation systems, the building of the railroad all across the nation, from the north to the south and including the west. We're going to see the millions again of Americans moving and settling in the western territories and organizing them into states gradually and integrating the so-called Wild West into the rest of the nation once again. So we see modern transportation systems. We also see modern communication systems during this time, in which we're going to see the coming of the telegraph and the telephone, which connected communities and connected people together. So we see that those innovations, those telecommunication systems, are also going to create a whole new world, and that people are going to be sharing ideas, sharing information. News are traveling rather instantaneously, and so this is really beginning what today we call the information age. Today we use the internet, but the origins of the internet, the very early origins go back to the 19th century with the introduction of telegraphs and telephones. And electricity, of course. Electricity is also going to be introduced around this time, and this is going to serve to power up all of the machinery that was innovated during that time, and that is going to be the life force again of this new modern age. We're going to see the coming of the light bulb, and houses are going to get electrical lighting. Public parks, cities, offices, business, industries will be powered by electricity, and this is going to create something new in society, and that is nightlife. Business activity is going to also take place at night, because prior to this time, prior to the coming of the electricity again, there was no nightlife. It was very limited, because it was very dark to travel from place to place. People had to use candles at home, to be able to see, or torches outside. So again, it was a very, very limited type of world that people operated under. But all of this is going to start changing with the coming of the new technological tools that are innovated, introduced in the late 19th century, that together are going to start shaping American society in a whole new way, in that it is becoming modern. This is what, again, generally speaking, we call modernity. Modern societies are societies that are trying to innovate their scientific systems, their technologies. They're trying to improve them and pretty much create more comforts, and try to use the new technologies and tools in order to facilitate the way people live, the way people actually carry out economic activities, for example, commercial activities, and so on and so forth. To increase the standards of living, to increase the lifespan of human beings on Earth, and so on and so forth. So it is very important that the world that we live in today, this modern world that we're so accustomed to, that we take for granted, because we were just simply born in this time in which all of those innovations are just here, like electricity, telephones, and so on and so forth. Back in the late 19th century, people were for the first time experiencing them, and they had to make sense of them, and pretty much provide some form of meaning to it, in that they had to, in a certain sense, understand what was going on, how human existence was changing, and they had to, pretty much provide a vision for what was happening around them, that they were entering a whole new world, and they pretty much had to accommodate, adapt to it again in a way that they will participate fully in it, and say, okay, so everything is changing, the way of life of people is changing. There's a lot of inventions taking place all around us, like railroads and electricity and so on and so forth, and they were surrounded by so many changes that people had to make sense of that again, some way or another, and adapt to a new reality. So this is something that we're going to actually pay attention to in this part one, and in order to pretty much look very deeply into this building of modern America. We're going to look at three topics. The first one that we're starting today is called the idea of progress in the formation of modern America. This is going to pretty much open up this discussion. All right, so this topic will introduce the class to the ideas that prevailed during this time as the changes were taking place. Massive industrialization, the commercialization of the economy, the creation of massive amounts of businesses and shops and industries across the country. The transportation systems, the communication systems that were changing, and so on and so forth, and the rise of big cities, and so on and so forth. And so the people living in this time gained the sense, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, that what was really taking place around them was that there was radical change taking place, but a lot of people gained the sense that this change was a change towards a better future. In other words, that all of the changes that were taking place were creating a better society, that there was really creating progress among human beings, that human beings were really creating progress for themselves, and that they were moving to a higher plane, if you will, that they were building a whole new civilization, a whole new world in which the changes that awaited them in the future were going to provide comforts, they were going to provide the ideal setting for human beings to reach their full potentials and attain human happiness. Okay, this ideal world, it was the vision of the future, in other words. They were now holding a vision that all of the changes that were taking place, as the new technologies, etc., that this was really pushing humanity to a new frontier, to a new horizon, in that life as we knew it was going to change, but it was going to change for the better. Okay, that we were moving to a new world, a new and better world, that it was imminent, that it was coming, and that everything that was simply taking place around them was a signal of that, in other words. So there was an idea that a lot of people, a lot of Americans were convinced of, that was the central meaning of human existence and the purpose of human existence on Earth. And that idea is called the idea of progress. People began to ponder on the idea of progress, that, progress is something that happens and has been happening for a long time. And so many people realized of that. Again, they were so convinced that they believed that that was the entire purpose of humanity. That was the entire purpose of being alive on planet Earth, and to attain progress on many levels and in many areas, by the way. So let me then now shift to the lectures of this particular topic, so we can discuss it fully, and so we can elaborate, into each one of the sections that are going to be very, very critical for understanding this topic. But first, please be aware that this topic is going to delve into the history of ideas more than, let's say, other aspects of history such as politics or economics. Not that that's not important. We're going to get there eventually in this semester. We're going to be looking at politics and economics, etc., in different topics. But this opening topic, this opening theme of the semester, what I want to do is take you back to this period of time to examine the moods, the ideas, the perceptions of the people that were living there, and how they were experiencing the world through their own eyes, And I have captured, and I mean, this is not something, of course, that I only propose. You know, there's a lot of historians that have looked at this period of time and have, of course, suggested as well that during this period of time of transition, when we were entering the modern age in the late 19th century, the idea of progress became almost sacred among the peoples of the United States. Again, this was something that was very cherished and so dear to people that they thought of progress almost in every area of human activity. They saw that we were improving ourselves and that was the meaning of life and human existence, to make ourselves better, to improve ourselves, to improve our societies, to improve our economic system, to improve our political system and make it better, so we can attain this goal, this vision of the future, so we can actually attain the ideal state, in other words. So we were, again, during the 19th century, this was the central idea, the mood of the age, the spirit of the age, so to speak, that people actually contemplated upon so much, in that this is something that many Americans believed in, the idea of progress. Now, this is very important because, again, this is going to be a history of ideas, looking at ideas themselves. Okay, so I consider that to be very important because that way we can understand the times much deeper. We can put ourselves in the shoes of others and try to see the world through them, and pretty much understand that this is how people are thinking and providing meaning to what was going on all around them. And again, this is something that even continues to today on many levels. You know, in the present day, there's still the sense, the notion that we're moving forward in time, that there is progress going on. Again, at least we believe that on a very subconscious level, that we can improve ourselves as human beings, as individuals, that we can improve our communities, that we can improve our societies, and so on and so forth, and we can make them better. Okay, we somehow believe, again, that that's the meaning of being alive. Okay, so this is just a, you know, explaining the purpose, if you will, of this topic, and why I have decided to start with this theme, this opening act that is going to serve to understand the rest of the semester, because otherwise we're not going to understand the rest of the semester, particularly the 20th century. It's not going to be very well understood. The 20th century was the century of modernities, in that not only was the United States already fully modernized and leading the modern world in the 20th century, but there were a host of countries all over the world that were trying to catch up with the United States and the European countries. In other words, that the United States and the European countries pioneer this type of change, this type of transformation, and serve as models, if you will, for all the rest of the world to follow. Again, in that many countries, many peoples, many societies all over the world, whether we're talking about Latin America, whether we're talking about Africa, or we're talking about the Middle East, or in Asia, for example, many societies looked at the leading modern nations of the world in the 20th century as pioneers, as examples, if you will, that they could be followed to a certain extent or other, not identical. I mean, it's not that a lot of countries just simply wanted to copy everything that was created here in the United States, but they wanted some form of transformation to take place in their own countries as well, whether they wanted the benefits of a modern economy, they wanted an economy that will be industrialized. For example, they wanted industrialization, they wanted to build industries, they wanted factories, okay, for the creation of jobs, for example, for the production of goods that could be exported elsewhere, okay. So they wanted the benefits, higher standards of living, Okay, for example, they also aspired at creating, better conditions, better social and economic conditions to their populations. So, in one way or another, they wanted something from the modern world. They wanted to emulate, they wanted to copy, they wanted to follow something of the modern world. Perhaps not everything, but they wanted to follow at some point some aspects of the leading modern countries of the world. They also wanted railroads, they wanted, etc., and communication systems, and so on and so forth. So this is important because, once again, without understanding this process of change, the modernization that took place in the late 19th century in the United States, we're not going to understand the rest of the course. Okay, the 20th century, again, is the century of modernity. In that was the main theme in global history. Countries were on a race, so to speak, in trying to rapidly modernize as quickly as possible and catch up with the European and North American societies. So it's important. Let's first understand that, and then we're going to be moving into other, of course, topics that will look closely into other aspects of American history. So, now having said that, there's also another component in this very first opening stages of the topic that I want to share, I want to comment upon, that are also going to help you understand the idea of progress and put it into context, so we can understand, how central, how important it was for people back then and even now, of course. And that is that this idea, the idea of progress, is an idea that developed particularly in the Western world, and when I mean the Western world, is where I'm talking about the globe. So the globe has an eastern hemisphere, or eastern side, if you will, or eastern, world, and there's also a Western world as well. Okay, so the eastern side of the world, the eastern hemisphere, encompasses the continents that today we call the continent of Asia, which present day, of course, we find Mongolia, China, Japan, for example, those countries, India as well, including Southeast Asia, again, the countries that today are places like Thailand, Vietnam, etc., the Philippines, and so on, including the continent of Australia. Again, that's the eastern hemisphere. And the western side of the world is what today, of course, we call Western Europe, and including North America, particularly the United States and Canada, for example. Of course, that includes Latin America. Latin America is part of the Western Hemisphere. This is not to say that it's not. It is. But in this case, what I'm referring to, that progress is an idea that flourished in the Western world, what I'm talking about is that this is an idea that flourished primarily in places like Europe. Okay, we call Western civilization. It's European civilization. Okay, and it flourished around the 1700s. Okay, in that century, this is the century when modernity begins in global history, and it begins in Europe. Okay, so the very first signs of modernization occurred in Europe, and it spread into North America, to the United States, later in the 1800s, the 19th century, by the way. And it is in this region, okay, in Western Europe and also in North America, where we're going to see, again, the idea of progress flourishing. And one of the main reasons why that happened was because of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, the Industrial Revolution was one of the key factors for the coming of modernity in Europe and in North America, and also the idea of progress that came with it. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution begins in Europe in the 1700s, particularly the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution is England. England was the pioneer of the Industrial Revolution, and what the Industrial Revolution was the introduction of machines or machinery. You know, the beginning of the machine age, in a nutshell. So if you really want to boil it down as to what really brought modernity, well, it was really a high-tech, industrialized world, the Industrial Revolution. Okay, that begins in Europe, particularly England, in the 1700s, and that it spread all over Western Europe and in North America. Okay, first and foremost, this is very important to understand. This is the beginning of modernity. The Industrial Revolution was key, was central to the coming of modernity. Okay, so once again, what is the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution was the introduction of machinery in the process of production. Okay, how people went about producing products that were needed, essential for human survival. Okay, everything that we need, you know, from tools to clothing and so on and so forth, is that the Industrial Revolution introduced new technologies, machinery. Machines are now going to start replacing human labor in the production of goods. More and more, and what the Industrial Revolution did was replace what people did by hand in the past, what artisans did by hand. Everything that people required for their daily living and activities was done by artisans for the most part. Artisans, again, crafted, you know, not only artwork, but also things like hats, clothing, jackets, pants, shoes, boots. Blacksmiths created iron tools that were required for farming, for ranching, and so on. Everything had to be crafted by hand, and it took a long time, by the way, because it was done by human labor. So this was a very slow process of production in the past. But what the Industrial Revolution did is introduce machinery in this process and accelerating in this process the rate of production. Yeah, so machines are going to now create every product that people required much faster and much easier. Again, machinery. It's called the machine age, by the way. That was really what the Industrial Revolution did. Of course, people will have to still operate the machines nonetheless, but the machine is going to be doing most of the work in this case, okay, in the line of production. So again, factories and industries are on the rise, and more people are working in factories, by the way. So that's another thing, is that how people went about earning their daily living is that they were now working in factories. Many of them actually are working in industries, operating the new machineries, the new technologies that were created for the production of those goods. Machines were also innovated for transportation purposes. I mentioned the railroad. That's another thing, that whatever was transported by the use of animal muscle and animal power, you know, like horses pulling carts or oxen and so on, that is going to be also done away with. The Industrial Revolution introduced machines to replace also animal power. And that we're going to see now the introduction of wagons and railroads and so on that are going to transport massive quantities of resources, materials, finished products, and even people are going to be moving around rather fast. So there were so many changes taking place in the 1700s with the introduction of new technologies, the Industrial Revolution, you know, machinery, for example, that this particular phenomenon called the Industrial Revolution, the Machine Age, caused European thinkers, many of them were philosophers, some of them were scientists and historians and so on, to start pondering on the idea of progress. Okay, they suddenly are thinking that what was really going on all around them is that human beings were using their potential, their creativity, their intelligence to know more about the environment, to discover how everything works, and they were using that knowledge to create new tools, more sophisticated tools that were so advanced that human life on Earth was changing along with it, that the new technologies were altering the way people live, by the way. And they believed that what was really going on, this idea called progress, was something that had been going on for literally since the beginning of the presence of human beings on Earth. In other words, that progress was not something that was barely happening in the 1700s, but rather they believed that progress has been going on for literally thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So, to give you an example, the European thinkers, historians, scientists, and so on, who were marveled at the changes taking place during the 1700s, during the Industrial Revolution, suddenly began to, propose that human history was the best example of progress, that progress has been going on all along for thousands and thousands of years, because when we look into the past, they said, again, this is something that they were saying, that when you examine the past, when you examine history, they said, if you go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, you find that the human beings that lived in the distant past were not as advanced as the ones that are living in their time. So they said, again, so they were becoming aware that once upon a time, human beings lived in an age called the Stone Age, okay? That, or human ancestors, thousands and thousands of years ago, lived in very limited conditions, what today we call, primitive. I don't know if that's the proper word to use, but that thousands and thousands of years, people lived in caves. Okay, they have no formal language to communicate. They have no writing systems back then, and they had no way of studying the world around them. They had no scientific systems as well to understand the world and accumulate knowledge. So they were living in very, very primitive conditions inside of caves, hunting animals, coming out of the cave from time to time to hunt for an animal, and so on and so forth, and then going back to the cave. But what they said is, well, we didn't stay in the cave. Humans got out of the cave at some point. In other words, look, there was a time when some humans dared to step out of the cave and to wander around the landscape and be, exploring the outside world. And of course, there were many dangers, there were many challenges along the way, but they were fearless in that they were able to actually, meet the challenges and so on. And at some point in their observations, their encountering with the natural environment, they began to wonder, how to actually, for example, create fire. They created fire, okay? So the creation of fire itself was a great moment of transformation. Again, the use of intelligence in order to inquire about something of the world, let's say. They were fascinated about the fire. They understood that fire was something that animals feared, the most, so they wanted to build it, they wanted to control it, make it in order to, again, um, uh, battle the animals or keep them away, ward them off, etc. And so at some point they arrived to that knowledge. How long it took, we don't know, but they arrived to that knowledge. Okay, so from the discovery of fire, humans were able to roam around with more confidence, camp out if necessary, etc. Cook their foods, and then later on they use fire to create tools. By the way, so again, so what the 1700 philosophers and thinkers are proposing is that we got out of the cave, we discovered fire, we use fire in order to create tools and to cook our food, to change our diet, and so on and so forth. And eventually we discovered farming. The discovery of agriculture, the farming as well, was a great moment of transformation. Once again, the use of knowledge. How human beings arrived to the point to discover how to create a new plant from scratch. It took them presumably centuries, if not thousands of years, to arrive to the mystery of the seed. That there was a seed in a plant that they could actually plant it in the soil, and then they had to learn, of course, what type of soil to use, that water was necessary, that sunlight was necessary, that oxygen was necessary. So all of that was something that they had to learn from observation of nature, trials and errors, and so on and so forth. So it was the spirit, the scientific spirit within human beings, again, that pushed them to explore the world around them, to accumulate knowledge, and to be able to apply it in order to create new tools that will enable them to change their society. So again, the discovery of farming was also a turning point that enabled the hunters and gatherers of the past to settle and create communities and begin to farm and so on and so forth. So this is very important. So once again, what the 1700s historians are really thinking here is that progress was real, because you can see the changes of growth, the phases or stages of growth of humanity from the distant past, from the Stone Age to the discovery of fire, and then later on the discovery of farming, and then agriculture, the building of cities, and so on and so forth, all the way to the 1700s, the time of the Industrial Revolution. So this is very, very significant. Okay, and this is a concept that the peoples, the thinkers living in those times became so convinced that if this is true, that we have been progressing over time in arriving to this point in which, well, now we're moving into the industrial age. Well, this is also true of the future, that what the future holds for us is a better world, that we will continue our scientific endeavors, accumulating more knowledge and exploring the world and finding more and more information and creating better and better tools and creating a whole new world in the future. So this idea of progress, what it really presents is the idea that history is moving in a certain direction, and this direction is moving humans to a higher and higher plane, in other words, of existence, that humans will be more knowledgeable in the future. We will have more technologies, more chances for survival that will perhaps, that is going to be used to solve a lot of the problems that afflict human beings, diminish human suffering, for example, and prolong the lifespan of individuals, in other words. Again, so there's so many issues involved in what progress entails, but it involves that we're moving to a higher and higher plane, because that's what we've been doing according to their own ideas, again, their own interpretations of history. Okay, so this is an idea that flourishes in Europe is pressing to America because it is also industrializing, and this is an idea that pervaded pretty much the minds of many Americans in the late 19th century. And this is how they interpreted the changes taking place around them. That, yes, it is true, life is changing rather fast because all of the changes that I just explained, from industries to railroads and telegraphs and everything else, electricity, but all of that together, what people believed is that we're moving into a new and better world. Okay, the 20th, 21st century and beyond, they believe we're going to be better somehow because of the changes, again, that were introduced, that science was advancing really fast and technology and so on and so forth. So therefore, we're moving into a whole new world, a futuristic, high-tech society, in other words. You can see that idea being displayed in many futuristic sci-fi films that come out every year in Hollywood, for example, in many countries around the world, of course. There's novels, there's comics, there's cartoons, there's movies, there are plays that talk about a futuristic, again, vision that presents a high-tech world. The technologies are unimaginable even for today's age, and cities are going to be totally different, reorganized. There's going to be, anti-gravity craft and so on and so forth, again, that people will use and so on. So again, this is not just fantasy, even though there's a lot of course, imagination in it. But this comes precisely from the age that we live in. Okay, this modern age in which there's a lot of innovation taking place. There's a lot of change taking place in the world of science and technology and other areas that convince people that this is real. And this is where we're heading, in other words. So having said that, now I understand that what this topic is going to talk about, what is going to elaborate in terms of the idea of progress, is what Americans living in this time consider progress, considered where progress was taking place, and consider the most important areas that humans had to make a lot of progress in. Okay, so there were three areas that people considered that progress was inevitable and that it was taking place and that humans had to participate in other words, okay, in the late 19th century. Okay, so number one, first and foremost, Americans believed that progress was taking place in the area of science and technology, as I mentioned just a moment ago. Okay, science and technology. The more science, in other words, the more that we know, that's what science is a body of knowledge that societies accumulate about the world around them, what they know about the natural world and how the natural world actually works. That knowledge, when it's accumulated, becomes what today is called a scientific system. This is just an understanding of how the world works. And technology means tool and tool making. Okay, so technology really refers to the tools that societies use and the knowledge to craft them that enables them to survive better in the environment. So science and technology is going to be critical in this topic because we're going to actually analyze it very, very fully, in that this is what people during those times considered to be fundamental for creating a whole new world, that progress has to take place in the realm of science and technology. This is something that we still believe in today ourselves, today in the present age. We believe that we must improve our science and our technology. I mean, we don't settle to have the same science year after year after year. We're constantly conducting research in every area possible, how to, okay, go about, for example, the cure of diseases, for example, how to build better cities, how to create, systems that are going to improve communities, the lives of people living in cities and so on, like sewage systems and so on and so forth, water treatment plants, etc. So, I mean, we're always trying to improve the way we live. We're always on the search for solutions. We are searching for more knowledge. In other words, whether it's the area of medicine or the area of city living and so on and so forth, the organization of the economy and so on and so forth, you name it. Okay, and technology as well. We expect better tools, better technologies every year. Okay, we just don't settle with the same piece of technology year after year. I mean, we expect that the cars that we're building are better, they're better built, that the computers that are manufactured every year, the cell phones and so on, all of those gadgets have more features, more capacity, more memory, and so on. We expect that. So we expect improvement, again, in those areas. And we consider it to be fundamental that they must take place if we are to live better. In other words, if we are to attain progress and move to a higher plane, we need to attain more and more progress in science and technology. Okay. The other area we're going to examine in this presentation is the area of the economics. Okay, because also during this time, people believed that one of the purposes of human existence was to attain progress in the realm of the economy. To improve the economic conditions, the economic well-being of individuals. That is to say, that this is the meaning of being alive. So the meaning of being alive is to improve your economic well-being, your economic condition. Work hard, save money, invest it, and so on, educate yourself, and so on and so forth, and rise in the economic ladder. We believe that that is one of the goals of human existence, again, to really improve ourselves economically. So we can also analyze that rather deeply, again, in this topic, progress as economic development. Okay. And number 3, the other aspect where people are thinking about progress is the area of what we call evolution. Because back in this time, there was a scientific theory proposed by a scientist, a biologist, an English biologist by the name of Charles Darwin, who in the late 19th century, again, I mean, this theory was published in the 1850s, but this theory is going to gain a lot of popularity, again, not only in England and Europe, but also in the United States, the idea of evolution. In a nutshell, what the idea of evolution said is that not only are human beings progressing, but what Charles Darwin said is that all of nature is engaged in a process of change, and that all of nature is moving to a higher and higher order or a higher plane. So every living species, every living organism, from a cell all the way to a plant, animal species, whether they're living in water or in the land, of all kinds, human beings as well, everything that is alive, that is a living organism, is evolving. That's what he said. And evolution means for Darwin that we are mutating from generation to generation, in that we're building a better and more survivable, a stronger and more fit organism. Okay, humans and living organisms of all kinds are struggling to survive in the environment, and those that are able to survive in the environment actually create the memory of that survival and pass it on to their descendants, and their descendants will inherit that's what Darwin said, the memory of survival that will enable the future generations to survive, to use the skills, to use the knowledge, to be more fit to survive in the future. So what Darwin said is that all of nature is progressing. Plants are progressing, trees are progressing, animals are progressing, humans, because this is a law, he said. This is a law of nature. This is a law of evolution. In that all living organisms are improving, in other words, over time. Okay? They're building up better structures, better organisms that are more survivable. That's what, again, he proposed. I'm not here, saying that, well, whether he's right or he's wrong. I'm just saying this is what he proposed. So therefore, the people of the late 19th century and across the 20th century, by the way, are going to be so influenced by the idea of evolution that this idea pushed people to propose new ways of organizing society that they believed were going to be better for the evolution of their own culture or their own group or their own nation. So again, the idea of evolution influenced, for example, the creation of ideologies, economic ideologies, political ideologies. And the 20th century is really the battleground, really that time, the 20th century, the competition of many ideologies that were competing with one another as to how to organize human society so people can evolve faster and better, again, and reach the goal of perfection, the creation of a perfect human, project. A human race has to be perfected, okay? People were thinking those terms. We have to perfect ourselves as human beings, and so therefore we have to organize our societies in a different way so this perfection can take place. Again, think about, for example, many ideologies that competed on the world stage in the 20th century. For example, capitalism, socialism, communism. In reality, those ideologies were influenced by evolution, because all of those ideologies, capitalism, socialism, communism, and others, what they really were presenting were ways of organizing human societies in a way that the proponents of those ideologies believed were going to allow people to reach this ideal world, okay, to evolve, in other words. How do we evolve? Well, capitalism has its own way of organizing society, socialism and communism, something that I will actually explain in more depth. So this is, again, a scientific idea that influenced the world of economics and the world of politics. Okay, as well, I'm going to explain that fully when we get there, but this is also something that is going to dominate the minds, again, of people during this time. Okay, so now let's cover then the first area or aspect of progress that people back in the late 19th century considered to be essential to improve upon, as I mentioned, to really advance society into the future and reach this ideal goal, this ideal society, this higher state, in other words. And that is the area of science and technology. As I mentioned just a moment ago, this is an area that people consider so important, knowledge and tools, because those are needed in order to solve problems. In a certain sense, what knowledge does, it enables us to understand how nature works in order to find solutions to some of the problems that arise from time to time, whether we're talking about health related issues, for example. We like to know more about that, conduct research on that, and so on, or how to bring about, for example, rain to water crops. the application of irrigation systems, electrical water pumps, in other words, to bring water to crops and so on and so forth. And so again, we can spend many minutes here talking about, again, the use of science for finding up solutions. And that's exactly what science does, again, is that it offers people the understanding, the knowledge of how to actually understand nature, and in order to actually try to harness the forces of nature in order to solve certain problems that arise. And technology, the same thing, is that use of tools, again, to precisely create a more comfortable existence, to produce goods, to survive better in the environment, and so on and so forth. So there was a deep faith, therefore, in the late 19th century in science and technology as the new ways or the new modes that were going to allow people to live better and to achieve this ideal state. The more knowledgeable we are, the higher the technology is, we get closer and closer to the goal. That is to say, that's what people were thinking, by the way. So, in order to understand, therefore, this process of change that we're discussing here, in that people began to develop a faith in science and technology and consider that this is something that we must achieve progress. Every year, we have to advance our knowledge. Every year we have to advance our technologies. We have to go back again to this time that we're studying here to understand again, how is it that people, began to place so much faith in science and technology, and the reason for that is that during this time there was a scientific revolution taking place, the rise of a new science again. So this is a whole new science was coming into being. By the 1800s, it was very well established, by the way, but it was a new science. Today we simply call it modern science. This is the science that we use in scientific circles, the scientific community is the one that actually uses it, in universities and colleges, centers of learning, centers of research, and so on. This is the established science, again, that the modern world uses in order to accumulate knowledge. But this science was born in the 1700s, actually, and it became mainstream in the 1800s. So the people of the late 19th century were really living in a transition in which there was the rise of a new science that was really making great breakthroughs, if you will, in terms of discoveries in the chemical world, the world of molecules, the world of medicine, and so on. And it was really, again, for the people living in those times, it was a sort of kind of miracles, the miracles of science, by the way. So please understand that in the late 19th century, people were living through a great transformation in the world of science. There was a scientific revolution, a revolution that began actually a century earlier, in the 1700s. In that, during the 1700s, what happened is that people began to develop new ways of studying the world, new ways of studying nature, and to find out how nature works. And during the 1700s, there was a scientific revolution that replaced one science that had been used for many centuries, particularly in places like Europe. And suddenly in the 1700s, the scientists of that century replaced the old science with a new science, the science of today. And so, to explain this much deeper to you, so you can understand what was the science of the past and the new science that is coming into being during this time, this scientific revolution that I'm talking about, so a revolution in science that occurred in the 1700s, proposed that the way that people studied the world in the past was based on a series of assumptions that were not really verifiable. You cannot really, in other words, prove it. So once again, in the 1700s, what the scientists living in that century are proposing is that the science of the centuries prior to this time that was used across Europe, and indeed it was used around the world, was a science that was not really verifiable, that the assumptions and the ideas that the scientists were proposing could not be proven, in other words, materially. Okay, why is that? Well, because the science of the past operated under the assumption that this world, what we call the natural world, the world of nature, was imbued with spirits. Okay, so everything that exists in nature, the plants, the animals, the elements, and so on, human beings, that there was a spirit or a spiritual entity, and many types of entities, by the way, that actually dwelled in the world of spirits. So the natural world, the world of nature, and the world of spirits were one and the same. They were intertwined. Okay, they were part of the same reality. That is to say, one and the same. So everything that happened in the world of nature, the assumption was everything that occurred, from rain to earthquakes, to droughts and so on and so forth. Everything that happened because there were spirits actually making it happen. Okay, so everything that occurred in nature, the movements of the planets, the movements of celestial bodies like the moon, for example, the sun, and so on. Everything that occurred was moved by spiritual beings and spiritual forces. That was the assumption, again, of the old science. So science and religion were pretty much part of the same system. They were not really separated in the past. And many of the scientists of old were actually religious figures as well. The people that conducted research and experiments and, etc. in the past, prior to the 1700s, in many cases were monks or priests and bishops and so on. So again, they were religious figures, in other words, because they were the people of knowledge. They were the individuals that were in charge of, exploring and the world, etc. But they used a scientific system in which the fundamental belief was that the spiritual world and the natural world were intertwined, and so everything that happened in the world of nature was caused by some form of spirit. So, for example, rain. Why does it rain? Well, because there's spirits that bring the rain. Okay, there's spirits that move the clouds. They create wind, and eventually they bring rain. All around the world, there are a lot of religions that hold beliefs in rain gods, for example. Okay, so there's a rain god that actually is responsible for bringing rain. So how do you make rain? Well, you have to pray to the rain god. You have to create a ritual, a ceremony, and do prayers and so on, and confer offerings to the rain god, and in that way you bring the rain. Why there are droughts? Well, in Europe, even up to the 1700s, there was still the belief that droughts were caused by spells and hexes that witches and sorcerers created. And so whenever a community was affected by droughts year after year after year, there was suddenly again the idea among the people that why there was a drought was because there was an individual living amongst them that was a witch or sorcerer, and they needed to, remove that individual from the community. If somebody acted, let's say, unstable, emotionally or psychologically, The assumption was immediately that that person was possessed by demons or was possessed by spirits, and that the solution to that was a ritual, a ceremony, an exorcism to drive out, those spirits, because spirits are the ones causing, in other words, the affliction, the instability. If somebody got ill or sick, in many cases, doctors, really in Europe, operated under the assumption that the cause of sickness and disease had a lot to do with the influence of evil spirits that entered the body. So in many cases, they had to be letting blood out of the individual. And this was done in hospitals, by the way. This is something taught in universities in Europe, for example, prior to the 1700s, because that was the science of the age, by the way. So again, the assumption back in the centuries before the 1700s was that, again, everything that happened in the world of nature was moved, caused, produced by different kinds of spirits. Some were good, some were bad. Okay? Now, in the 1700s, there's going to be a revolution in science, because the scientists of the 1700s, what they're actually proposing is that, and once again, this is what they're saying, okay? This is what those scientists are saying, is that those two worlds that people consider to be one and the same, the spiritual and the world of nature, that they were pretty much separated and independent. So this is, again, what the new science is proposing, that the spiritual world was removed and independent and operated in a different plane from the natural world, and that the natural world operated independently based on certain mechanical laws. In other words, many of the scientists believed in the 1700s that when God created the world, that he created the world in like a machine, okay, just like a machine. So the machine is programmed to function in a specific way, is programmed to operate in a specific way, and God pretty much left the world to operate on its own based on certain laws, the laws of nature, in other words. And all we can do, humans, is discover those laws, okay? Discover the laws, but they're mechanical. They operate on their own. And again, this is something that the scientists were proposing. Those ideas are not necessarily, I don't necessarily endorse those views myself. I'm just saying, this is what the scientists of the time were saying. So, therefore, what the scientists are now proposing here in the 1700s, with introducing a new science, is that scientists, therefore, must only study the natural world from a material level, and only a material level. Instead of considering the presence or influence of spirits acting upon people or acting upon the natural world, that instead that scientists will have to observe nature to understand the programming, the mechanisms that make it work materially. So why, for example, there's rain? Well, a lot of scientists are now going out and making observations, material observations, to see the world and how it works. And they said, well, what happens is that we have to understand the mechanics of rain. Okay, there's a mechanism, there's a material process, involved in rain. So instead of considering, again, spirits, moving clouds, and the rain gods, what they instead attempted to do was discover how is it that rain is produced mechanically as a mechanism. So they said, okay, so rain comes from the sky. We see that it comes from clouds. Whenever we see the formation of dark clouds, rain comes. So we know that, again, rain comes from clouds. So you start from that. So how did the clouds, get formed? How is it that water is transferring to the atmosphere? So they said, oh, well, we see actually that water is evaporated from time to time. You can see that. You can observe it. A body of water under severe, high temperatures, when there's summer heat, etc., it gets evaporated. It turns into vapor. So where all this water goes, it goes up. It goes upward into the atmosphere. Oh, so that's what causes the formation of clouds. Is all of the water from the surface of the Earth that is transferred up into the atmosphere under heat conditions. High heat, that is to say. So you start taking notes, okay? Oh, okay, so say all this gas, all this vapor turns into clouds, there's cloud formation, and when the clouds become so filled with water, they burst. And so we have precipitation, and this is bringing rain. And so what the scientists are now saying is that there's a mechanical aspect, a mechanical process involved in the process of rain, that they're leaving out now the influence of spirits, and they're just seeing this as a very material, mechanical process. Okay, and that's exactly what the new science is now involved in. Since the 1700s, this new science is going to introduce the idea of materialism. Okay, that we live in the world of matter, and that the only thing that humans can know is matter itself, because this is the world that we experience. Of course, this is the world that we can actually study, measure, detect, and so on and so forth. So again, this is the new science. Okay, it's a new way of studying the world that is replacing the way that people study the world of the past. Again, so they're separating science and religion, and science and religion are going to be totally separated from this point onwards. Again, so this is very important. This is the scientific revolution. Again, this revolution in science is introducing a more materialist approach to study the world of nature and trying to understand how it works by studying matter and trying to gather material facts in the process. So again, the people of the late 19th century in the United States were really experiencing a shift in perception. And the people that were trained in the new science and the new, again, ideas of the scientific revolution were moving now into a more scientific oriented mode of thinking. And in many cases, there's going to be a rift between those that stayed in the old camp, the religious camp, and those that moved into the scientific camp, in other words. So there was a shift in perception. It's called a paradigm shift. One way of studying and viewing the world was replaced by another one. Okay, one paradigm. A paradigm is like a filter or a model by which you see the world. Okay, this paradigm of the past that saw nature and the spiritual world together was suddenly replaced by a new one that only saw the material world acting independent from the spiritual world. Not that the spiritual world didn't exist, it's just that the new scientists are saying those two worlds were simply just separated from one another. Okay, so once again, we're going to see that transition during the late 19th century from using faith, faith in, spiritual, entities and spiritual forces, in appealing to them for solutions. How people tried to go about solving problems in the past is that they perform rituals to the gods, the goddesses, the spirits, and so on that they believed in, for protection, for health, for good luck, for abundance, and so on. They created a series of rituals because they had faith in that, and now people are moving into a more scientific-oriented world in which people are going to use technology, and not necessarily ritual, but technology is going to be used for solving problems. Okay. All right, so we stop here, and we're going to actually place an end to our first session. So this is the end of session 1 of this first topic. I will send you an email as of now, indicating, notifying you that the video lectures are ready. But please be advised that for this week we have already had two classes, so to speak. The first class was the introduction to the class and the syllabus, and then the second class is this one. It's starting the lectures. Next week, I will post 2 more videos that will continue with this topic on the idea of progress. If you have any questions, please email me and I'll respond immediately to your questions. Okay, so that's all I have for you, and I'll see you then next week for the following lectures. Good night.